Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our roundtable of panelists for today. First, we have Mr. Todd McFarland, who's the Deputy General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Mr. Tim Schultz, who's the president of the First Amendment Partnership. We have Mr. Andre Wong, who's the general counsel of the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have Dr. Timothy Golden, who's a professor of philosophy from Whitman College. Gentlemen, great having you here today and looking forward to our conversation. You know, not too long ago, I was interested to see that Louisiana public schools are now required to display the Ten Commandments in all classrooms after Governor Jeff Landry signed a requirement into law. And it said that the state lawmakers are mandating a poster-sized display, large, easily readable, in font, and they want it in every classroom, and that they will receive state funding from kindergarten through university if you are part of the organizations that actually are under state law. The wording was kind of interesting when they said they wanted a poster-sized display of the Ten Commandments. It was even more interesting that they were talking about that it had to be of a specific font. You know, if you quote unquote look at where this has gone from years back, and we've even seen some of this type of activity happening in other states, there were many opponents that said, listen, we can be religious, but the idea of continuing to want to push the Ten Commandments when there are a group of individuals who also call themselves religious that don't use it as the foundation of their religious beliefs. But in Louisiana, they're saying that this is a foundational document of our state and national government. You know, when you start taking a look at some of these issues, it just seems pretty incredible that we find ourselves now talking about the Ten Commandments should be displayed in a public school. And to be honest, I've been to a number of Christian churches that don't even display the Ten Commandments. And the idea now that this is being mandated as something that should take place here in this particular state, it just makes me wonder what on earth are we thinking about here, or is this just where we are? You know, what is your view on this when you think about this from your standpoint?
Well, I mean, there's a lot going on here, Orland. And so my first take, and we're going to talk about this a lot, is that this is probably constitutional, but I also think it's silly. I think it's silly because I think in the end, we all know what this is, right? It's a flex by the Christians who control the Louisiana legislature. And so as a Christian, I look at what Jesus said to his disciples when he called them together. And he says, you know how the Gentiles rule. They lord it over them, right? They lord it over the people. And that's not the way I want you to be, right? And I think that's what this really is. It's lording it over the people who don't share the views of the Ten Commandments, or it's saying to people who don't share the kind of Christian tradition, we found this way that we can constitutionally lord it over you. And by golly, that's what we're going to do. And I think we all know that that's what's happening here. Everybody knows it. And I think it's unfortunate.
Yeah, so, I mean, I agree with Tim Schultz. This is certainly, as he put it, a flex. But I think there's something else there. And for me, I am always suspicious of hyper-religious ideas and legislation that emanates from conservative Southern legislatures in the United States. We have a history here in the United States of Southern states touting religious views, claiming to be good Christians while engaging in horrific social and cultural practices, from chattel slavery through lynching, through voter suppression. Again, it is, as Tim Schultz said, it is a flex. But I think the actions of the legislature and the governor in Louisiana cannot be fully appreciated outside the context of a tortured racial history in the United States that has often been justified with religious views from the Judeo-Christian tradition. And to sort of do this in a way that mandates it, to me, is really troubling, especially when you view this in light of the fact that many other conservative legislatures have decided to excise certain aspects of America's history from public school curriculums. For me, as an African American who sort of understands that history, this is a very troubling development because to me, it smacks of a sort of white Christian nationalism.
But Todd, when I look at this and we start saying, well, no one's saying that this should be quote unquote federal law, but maybe in this particular jurisdiction, in this particular state, you know, and you might even see that there may be a large number of individuals from a Christian perspective. It's clear that this is probably a view that some minority religious groups may not be comfortable with. But in a state like Louisiana, who's looking to do something locally, is that a problem? Or is that something that we have to still step in and say we should be looking out for protection of minority positions from a religious standpoint, even if it's just within specific state lines?
You know, this is, you know, that's what the whole point of a constitution is, right? Is to protect minority religions. You know, if you're the majority religion, you don't need the Constitution because the democratic process is going to protect you. You know, I think back to my 8 years of grade school and my 4 years of high school and my 4 years of college, and I can only think of one setting which I knew can remember what was on the wall. I maybe my grade school teacher, may God rest his soul, failed there. So this is really not so much about the kids and what they're going to see. They will see this and move on from it very quickly. It is, I think, as Tim Schultz said, and Tim Golden, you know, this is a flex by the Republican legislature. It's a desire to see how far we can push this. You know, the argument that this isn't just solely religious is accurate in the sense that Ten Commandments have a secular meaning and a secular view. And, you know, I think we'll probably talk about this later, and have been displayed in, you know, various courthouses and different settings. But this is not part of a larger display. This is not part of, you know, a broader historical setting. This is one particular version of the Ten Commandments, by the way, and they've truncated it. This is not the full biblical text from either of the places the Ten Commandments can be found. And you know, it is a desire by legislatures to see how far they can push this. And they've gotten a little bit smarter than before in the Kentucky case that looked at this at the beginning, and they've tried to put this in the right, you know, context, but everyone does know what it is. And, you know, this is also, I think, a reaction to, quite frankly, a Supreme Court and liberal activists that were trying to push God out of almost every part of public life back in the, you know, the 70s and early 80s, right? And it's like, you know, this tension about what is the appropriate place for religion in the public sphere. But this is, you know, like I said, I think this is very much more symbolic than it is going to have actually any impact on actual kids in Louisiana.
So, Andre, where are we going to end up with this when it's all said and done? Because, you know, we call this a flex, and you're somebody who's worked for the church, you're a general counsel, but you're also somebody who's run for office to be part of a legislature before as well. So isn't the idea that when you win, part of what you get to do is flex? So, I mean, I guess to the victor goes the spoils, or is this really an issue that we need to be looking at this from a U.S. constitutional standpoint, or the fact that you win and you're not allowed to flex?
Yeah, so this is much bigger than just running for a local office or a state legislative race. You know, this is a flex, but it's a flex under the guise of history. This is a historical document showing the underpinnings of law in the United States. Well, if the Ten Commandments is a historical document, then it would be taught in history classes or political science courses. You know, so but you know, when was I can't recall a history or political science course where the Ten Commandments was discussed. But look, really it's interesting that we have the version that will be displayed. Now, if it's really a historical document, then what about the the Ten Commandments version of the Jewish version of Exodus, or the version in the Quran. All these are holy to different people. So nor are the Ten Commandments the basis of law for all people, for people who do not believe the Christian Bible. Sikhs, Hindus, Native American religious practitioners, and others. So where do we end up, Orlin? This is going to be a question that's going to endure for decades, if not centuries, to come.
Tim Schultz, this idea of historical documents, we're talking about the Ten Commandments. Never heard anybody talk about maybe we should have the U.S. Constitution in a school, up on the walls, with a big font size, or how about the Federalist Papers? Where do we go with this? Or is this whole historical, quote unquote, documentation thing really just a smokescreen in the midst of this whole conversation?
I mean, I think those are really fair points. You might find a constitution on some school walls, but not because it's being compelled by a state legislature. And by the way, notice, if you're a Christian, as I think, we all are, our understanding of the Ten Commandments is to some degree modified by Jesus's commentary on the Ten Commandments in the Sermon on the Mount. And so if you want an ethical code for students, the Sermon on the Mount seems like a far more appropriate thing to have on the walls of the school, but everybody knows that would be unconstitutional, right? So they're kind of able to kind of put this in, kind of shoehorn this in as an exception to the rule against, government coercion that's inherent in the First Amendment. And they've managed to do this, even though I think as a matter of moral instruction, it fails a whole lot of tests.
I'm trying to imagine, Orlin, Federalist Alexander Hamilton's defense or argument against the Bill of Rights in Federalist 87 posted next to the Ten Commandments. That would be really, really interesting.
I want Hammurabi's Code. If we're going to start about law and historics, I want Hammurabi's Code put right up there next to it.
There you go.
And start explaining to all those little kids, if you misbehave, the penalty is death. But
wow.
That would maybe shape them up.
Well, the interesting thing about all this is that the idea that people are really trying to figure out from a secular standpoint how to bring in more principles that many of us would call Christian principles, but they don't seem to be able to find a way to maybe just use language that said, how about you tone down your rhetoric and just have respect for your fellow man? And maybe that in and of itself would cover all of this. We're just talking about Louisiana and the Ten Commandments, and ironically, the ACLU decided it was going to sue the state of Louisiana because U.S. civil liberties groups have now decided that what is happening here is just blatantly unconstitutional. This new law that's requiring, state-funded schools to display the Ten Commandments in classrooms, they believe has just gone too far. So the ACLU has now basically filed a lawsuit, quote unquote, in conjunction with groups like Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. And they are now trying to figure out how do we unring this bell that Jeff Landry and also the legislature in Louisiana has really put forward. And it's ironic that even some of the individuals in Louisiana who moved forward with this used the quote, "I can't wait to be sued." Well, Todd, it looks like mission accomplished. The ACLU has now decided they're going to sue, quote unquote, the state as it relates to this. And now when we start to see this happening, the ironic thing is I didn't even know that we had something to sue about. It's almost like law comes into place and it's like jumping to the courtrooms before it even comes into effect. What do we have going on here? And is this where we're going with, let's just throw it out there to flex. Let's just sue to flex without even actually have anything maybe specific to sue about? Or am I missing something here, Todd?
Oh no, this is the Lawyers Full Employment Act. This was as soon as this was drafted, they knew that they were going to get sued over this. Embraced it. In fact, ACLU did not disappoint and brought the case, I think, the Monday after it was signed in and became effective. ACLU is a sophisticated litigant, has brought a lot of these cases. They know the ins and outs. You ask, is there anything to sue about? Because, school hadn't started. No Ten Commandments were actually up. but you had a state law that was in place, and that gives you enough. ACLU was very careful about who they brought as plaintiffs. The lead plaintiff in the case is the Reverend Darcy Roque. That was not an accident, right? They do not want this to be viewed as being, quote, anti-religious. So they got members of faith, very progressive faith, to bring it. And then, of course, there's a bunch of parents and their children who are bringing it. And I will spare our audience the rules and observational standing when it comes to First Amendment and religion cases, but ACLU believes that they have the ability to bring this. And at the end of the day, what they're arguing is, listen, there's people that disagree with the message here, who do not want a religious message in a public school, or want a different religious message, or just don't think this is appropriate, and they're being harmed by this, and therefore they get to challenge it. Unless the Supreme Court changes the rules on when you can sue considerably, which is not beyond the realm of possibility, they probably will be able to challenge it, and we'll see how this winds its way through the court system. But it will keep the lawyers busy. And it also, quite frankly, works to the advantage of the legislators, right? Like, you can fundraise on this, you can run on this in certain parts of the district. This is going to be a very popular thing. There was a few years ago, and we can talk about this later, a Ten Commandments monument being put on the Arkansas Capitol grounds, and the legislature that was behind that, I mean, it was a major part of what he was running for. And he got the added benefit of being sued by the Satanists. And so you can imagine, in addition to ACLU, so you can imagine, like, what's better than being sued by Satanists if you're a, conservative Republican in the South?
Yeah, the brief actually is very interesting. That it really is almost a primer for first-year law students in constitutional law, where it states that only twice does the Constitution mention religion, and both times it makes clear that the country is non-religious. The first mention of religion is in the body of the Constitution itself, in Article 4, in Article 6, where there's no religious test to run for public office. And the second mention is of course in the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So you just reading the pleadings on this is very, very interesting. That and the other argument is very basic, that the First Amendment disallows state religion, that this is for the benefit of both church and state, and that the free exercise and the establishment clauses of the First Amendment should always be read together to define the scope of religious protection under the Constitution.
Tim Schultz, I find interesting that one of the arguments is, listen, this is happening down in the Bible Belt. And probably everybody in the United States, when they hear the Bible Belt, have this part of the country that they can immediately start thinking about. And the idea that some state in the Bible Belt actually would like to put the Bible somewhere in public doesn't seem to be that strange a stretch. It almost seems, well, it's culturally, that's how it is down there. And as a result thereof, it should be okay. Is this the nomenclature we are moving forward with in life, where, you can be, in the liberal Northeast, you're in the Bible Belt, you're in the, the wacky West, where are we going with all of this? Or is it just simply people are deciding, I'm just going to throw stuff against the wall and let the courts figure it out. And if I roll the dice and end up in the right court, maybe I'm okay.
Well, there's a lot there in that question, Orland. But so I think that federalism is great, and as a general matter. Okay. The wacky West needs to stay, be the wacky West. I like the wacky West. And the South has certain mores, but, the South had other mores that deeply violated human rights and the Constitution, and they had to be stopped. And I'm not comparing this as sort of on a moral or intellectual matter to slavery and Jim Crow. I'm just saying federalism is good, but there are limits to it. And one of those limits is the Constitution itself. And so I do think that this is, Todd says, both a full employment act for lawyers. It's also a full employment act for political fundraisers. Think about how much money the ACLU is raising off of this lawsuit. Think about how much money the Christian right is raising off of defending against this lawsuit over something that in the end, I think, as Todd rightly said earlier, is probably not going to make much difference in the attitudes of students. So again, this strikes me as a kind of culture war, a condensed symbol of the culture war, right? A condensed symbol. One even might say, if you're Dr. Tim Golden, you may even call it a synecdoche of the culture war, right? But that's part of what makes it so silly. All this energy, all this money, all these court filings spent over something that really shouldn't have happened in the first place. And really, it was just a volley in the culture war being put out there by the Louisiana legislature.
I tend to agree with Tim and Todd and Andre as well. This whole idea, right, it's almost like it's a cultural sort of performance, right? It's something that we do. We do this. The legislators in Louisiana somehow perhaps are emboldened by they're emboldened by the overturning of Roe, right? And they see the Dodd's decision as a gateway into having all of their social, political, and cultural wish list fulfilled. And so they start with this, and that's why the governor said he couldn't wait to be sued, right? This is almost a performative ritual of how we handle culture. And as Todd put it, most of the students, if these displays actually go up and as they're on display, well, they'll just become sort of in the background, right? And what does that tell us, right? So I think that says something to us about how, in our desire to promote religion and religious principles and Christian principles, we become counterproductive because you end up producing the very opposite outcome. The Ten Commandments don't become something to be revered. It's just a picture hanging on the wall. And so we are perhaps counterproductively diluting the very message that we're trying to promote, and we're not doing the students any real service at all, particularly in this day and age when you have tons of information available to students right at their fingertips through their phone, who may look at the display and decide to reject it altogether. So the things that matter to people in politics and the culture wars that matter to people in political life really are sometimes out of step with where we really are and how people really think.
Orlin, if I can, I'd like to contrast this to another set of litigation that's going on, which may seem different, but I think actually are connected, maybe not in a legal standard, but in sort of a cultural. So there's another case that's going to be going up to the U.S. Supreme Court, McMood versus McKnight. And that case comes out of Montgomery County had some books on that were at least purportedly supposed to be on cultural awareness and non-discrimination, but they were LGBT sort of promotion books, right? And so one of them for kindergartners was called Puppy Pride. And it was required to be in the classroom. Teachers at least had to make it available. They were encouraged to read from it. And then the litigation came out of it. Parents were no longer able to opt out of it. And for a parent to be told that their student must be exposed to a book called Puppy Pride, and regardless of their religious or other beliefs, that they are going to have this sort of force fed to them by the government on their kids, but they can't put the Ten Commandments up in their in a classroom, is just going to hit a lot of parents as being wrong, right? That the public schools have not turned themselves into sort of a neutral place of learning. They've turned themselves into propaganda, factories and indoctrination, factories. And when you do that, you're going to create a cultural blowback. And when you're promoting a particular agenda, as opposed to just say, oh, I don't know, teaching how to kids to read and do math, which we, compared to the rest of the developed world, suck at, maybe our schools should get back to, doing the basics and quit worrying so much about these cultural issues on both sides, right? I doubt Louisiana is at the top of the game when it comes to math scores. Maybe that should be their focus. Maybe Montgomery County should be focusing on other things than, promoting LGBT agendas.
Andre,
and we're actually noticing that in the enrollment of our in our private church schools, at least here in the Northwest, we are seeing record enrollment of community non-church members families in our church schools, exactly because of that issue.
I think when we look at this and we're trying to figure out, what can we do to have a better society, and the idea of putting forward laws that would hopefully get people to be thinking about it from a biblical perspective to some degree just cuts both ways, because if you don't want to get involved with what one individual's thinking and you don't want to really have to be able to change everything so that you basically take care of everyone's points of view, then the reality is you got to keep it out of that square completely. Andre, tell me something I don't know.
This is more of a personal confession. After 16 years of church school education, 3 years of law school, I only recently learned that the 10 Commandments were written on both front and back of the tablets. Exodus 32:15.
Did not know that. Scary to say. Tim Golden, tell me something I don't know.
Well, I think our good friends in Louisiana will appreciate this, since they are good Christians down there and want to promote the 10 Commandments. On April 16th, 1873, the Colfax Massacre happened on Easter Sunday. A day associated with resurrection was marred by death as an angry white mob descended on Colfax, Louisiana, and killed over 100 African Americans. Their cases, they were tried under the Enforcement Acts, and no one was held accountable for them. So maybe you should put a little more history in with the reading and math and be a little less concerned about the 10 Commandments.
Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
It's hard to go after that, but I was going to suggest that the plot of National Treasure 3 should involve Nicolas Cage breaking into Louisiana schools and stealing all those copies of the 10 Commandments. The major plot twist is in the final act. He finds the real copy of the 10 Commandments buried under Orlin Johnson's house.
Todd McFarland, tell me something I don't know.
Back in 2017, the state of Arkansas erected a statue with the 10 Commandments inscribed upon them. Before ACLU Arkansas could bring a lawsuit in the next couple of days, one Mr. Philip Reed drove his vehicle into it and knocked them down. This was not the first time Mr. Reed had knocked down the 10 Commandments monument. He had done the same 3 years before in the state of Oklahoma.
Gentlemen, thank you for that information. Don't know where I'd be without it. Thanks again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.